He pushed through the turnstile like someone late for a meeting, head down, cap pulled low, hood drawn tight enough to wash his face in shadow. The platform was a low hum of daily lives, the hiss of brakes, a woman rehearsing a phone call, the faint scent of yesterday's rain mixed with frying oil from the vendor down the stairs. For most people, he was just another commuter, a man in a public city that does not notice its own miracles. But some places make anonymity hard to sustain. The subway has eyes that learn to read the smallest tells. At the far end of the platform, under a flickering sodium lamp, a teenager sat on a well-worn bench. He had learned to be invisible by watching others fail. How a hand lingered on a wallet, how eyes slid away from someone who smelled like the street. He had learned that survival depended on attention to small things, the rhythm of a walk, the tilt of a chin, the way someone hummed without thinking. His hoodie was patched at the elbow. His shoes were not new, but they kept out the cold. He collected the minute details of strangers the way other people collected postcards. He watched the man in the cap the way a reader turns a page. The cap hid a face. The headphones made the mouth set into a practiced neutrality. But there was a right-hand habit, thumb brushing the seam of the cap, that the street kid had seen before in countless old videos and in the back of his own head. It was the same nervous motion a boy made when he was 1,000 miles from home and afraid of the world. There was also the hum, a thin, instinctual melody that slipped between the static of the platform speakers. It could have been anything, a fragment of a pop chorus, the ghost of a hook, but it landed like a name. Recognition did not arrive as a shout or a headline. It arrived as a quiet spike in the teenager's chest, the sudden rearrangement of the ordinary into something possible. He sat very still, as if the whole subway might shudder and the secret dissolve. He had been around people with names and faces that shine on TVs. He had also been around the kind of loneliness that made names mean nothing. This particular name was both a rumor he'd hummed along with in the shower and a figure he'd held at arm's length because celebrities lived on a different shelf of life. Now that shelf was right across from him. The man in the hood moved closer to the edge of the platform. The train's brakes sang, a long metallic note. The teenager felt the line inside himself, exposure or intimacy, pull taut. He had choices, each one simple and sharp. He could scream, he could pull out his phone and record an incriminating clip, he could ask for money or a selfie the way some people asked for anything they could get. Or he could speak, like a normal human being, and see what the other would do with privacy. He stood up. Not for spectacle, not for reward, but because curiosity had become a living thing in him. The platform smelled of old paperbacks and coffee. The man's hoodie smelled faintly of expensive cologne mixed with the dust of travel. The teenager walked up as if to ask for directions, then said what he had not intended to say aloud. "You hum that song sometimes." The man blinked. A brief, disarming human pause. He lowered his hood with an economy of motion that suggested the move had been practiced and then abandoned. His face was not what a television implied. It was tired in a way fame does not reveal, lined at the corners by travel and small private worries. He smiled anyway, quietly, without the exaggerated flash of cameras, and when he replied, his voice was careful, as if emerging into ordinary air. "Sorry, I don't mean to bother," the teenager continued, the words tripping out of his mouth as if the subway had rearranged the rules. "You sound like him." A smaller hush passed across the station, as if something had softened. There was a recognition that had nothing to do with the millions who wore his name on t-shirts. The man nodded, eyes honest, and for a second the platform felt like the tiny room of an honest conversation. "Yeah," he said, "it's me. Look, For a moment, the teenager's first instinct, shout, exposure, the desperate gain of a recording, fought with another instinct, respect. He thought of younger siblings who would adore the idea of a message, of the dignity of a quiet exchange, of the strange power of being seen and not displayed. He swallowed the urge for spectacle and stepped closer, offering instead a question wrapped in the plain garment of need. "You got a lighter?" he asked, not for a cigarette, but for a stove downstairs where his friend heated food. It was a small thing, almost comically domestic, but in that smallness lay the true texture of the kid's life. The man reached into his pocket, pulled out a lighter that was more expensive than anything else on the platform, and handed it over without a flourish. He didn't pose for a camera. He didn't make a scene. He simply gave the lighter, and with it, a small, reverent sliver of attention. The exchange shrank the platform into a pocket of two voices. They spoke in soft, clipped sentences that fit the station's rhythm. The kid talked about a sister with a scraped knee, about a shift at a diner that paid enough for coffee but not for boots, about the way a pair of new shoes could feel like a defiant hymn. The man listened like someone who owned the words and wanted to keep them whole. He asked questions nobody else had bothered to ask about the kid's plans. He leaned in toward the human geometry of someone else's life and stayed there. At some point, one of the commuters, someone with a slow camera thumb and a heart, lifted their phone and recorded not the reveal, but the quiet mercy. The clip was a few seconds long, a man in a hoodie removing it to reveal a face, an exchange of a lighter, a hesitant smile from both people. The person who filmed did not shout. The caption would not mock. When the train pulled in, the clip slipped into the current of the internet like a pebble into a still pond. If this story is moving you and you'd like to see more human moments like this, consider subscribing, and if you can, find the link in the description to support local youth outreach programs. The clip landed where such clips usually land, into a scroll, into a shuffle of attention. But something different happened. The recording didn't go viral because it revealed glamour or scandal. It spread because it felt true. Viewers recognized the delicate decency of the scene, the choice to be private, the refusal to weaponize attention. Comments arrived in lines that read like small prayers. "He could have asked for everything and asked for nothing," wrote one. "Sometimes a lighter is a lifeline," wrote another. Within hours, the exchange had reached a handful of people who did something other than click and move on. A local cafe owner messaged the person who filmed and offered 2 free meals a week for anyone who needed them. A small street ministry matched the cost of boots. A volunteer who had seen the clip recognized the platform and offered to organize a one-day drive the next Saturday. The ripple was not instantaneous charity from a headline. It was a slow coming together of people who carried small resources and the will to use them. Back on the platform, the teenager and the man in the cap continued their quiet. The man, who had slipped into the city to be alone and was now a part of someone else's day, did something small but deliberate. He crouched down and spoke into his phone, recording a short, unpolished message for the teenager's sister. He didn't write the script. He simply told the sister to smile, to keep the scraped knee clean, to know that someone she'd never met was rooting for her. He signed it with a single line, "Be brave," that traveled from a microphone to the girl's phone hours later like a piece of unexpected mail. The teenager felt his throat tighten. He had known people who bought kindness as spectacle, and people who traded secrets for exposure. This was not either. It was a choice to name someone and then to let that naming be private, as if small favors saved dignity. When they parted, they did not take photographs together. They shook hands, and the handshake lasted longer than a photograph would. Word spread in ways that felt honest, because the people who amplified it treated the kid like a person, not a character, and treated the celebrity like a man trying to do right in a world that often made gestures performative. Journalists wrote pieces that were less about the star than about the exchange, an essay about what it means when someone with so much chooses discretion over spectacle, an op-ed about the power of attention to change the texture of someone's day. Local radio ran a short segment and interviewed the cafe owner who was handing out meals. Donations came in modest sums from people who wanted to do something practical instead of liking a post. A volunteer coordinator started a spreadsheet, then a schedule. The spreadsheet became a roster, the roster a program. The teenager did not become a symbol overnight. He continued to play the same parts of his life that he always had: the odd job, the lookout for his younger sister, the careful saving towards small necessities. But something shifted. People who had never noticed him began to ask his name instead of assuming. A pair of boots arrived, not wrapped in cameras but in a plain box, with a note that read, "Your feet deserve to be warm." It was the kind of note that refused to ask for attention. In the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated but never fully repeated itself. Impromptu volunteer groups gathered to hand out coats on cold mornings. The cafe set up a small whiteboard with the names of people who had been helped, not to boast, but to track who might need a hot meal tomorrow. The man in the cap, who had gone back to anonymity after the brief day, was present in stories and not in selfies. A recorded message shared for a sibling, a lunch paid, a promise to help a local shelter with a modest donation. The donations were not enough to remake a system, but they were enough to fund a series of practical interventions: a weekly meal, a shoe drive, a mentorship pairing between the teen and a staff member at a youth outreach center. If you had stood on that platform days later, you would have seen the same salt-bleached tiles and the same flickering light. You might have missed the change entirely if you weren't looking for it. But there was a small sign taped to the bench where the teenager had first stood, a laminated card that said in plain letters, "Community meals every Saturday. Ask at the cafe downstairs." It was not a plaque. It did not claim to be a movement. It was a line of notice, an invitation, and that was precisely its power. The man in the cap left his own trace in modest ways. He did not start a foundation with millions in fanfare. He made small commitments that layered into something steadier: a pledge to fund 2 months of meals for a shelter, a recording he made for an online series that raised a few $1,000s for boots and bus passes, a quietly paid tab at the cafe that left the owner stunned. He kept returning sometimes, unannounced, inconspicuous, just to see that things were still done without cameras. When he did appear, he wore a different cap, a different coat, as if practicing the ritual of invisibility and presence in equal measure. The teenager's life did not transform into a montage of redemption. There were still nights on the cold streets and days of odd jobs. But he began to keep a list of small goals: a pair of boots by autumn, a place to study for his GED, a phone that could hold more than one recorded message. The volunteers that showed up had names and faces. One woman, who had grown up in the neighborhood herself, became a recurring presence. She taught the teenager to budget for something beyond immediate needs, to hold a bank account, to think in weeks rather than days. Small structures formed: a mentorship meeting here, a bus pass there. That, stitched together, gave the teenager room to breathe. The clip that started it all never pretended to be anything other than a human moment. People shared it because it revealed the possibility of small decencies in public spaces: a celebrity refusing spectacle, a marginalized youth refusing to be exploited. It triggered conversation about privacy and dignity, about the responsibility of those with attention to use it well. Some commentators suggested that the real story was not the celebrity's presence, but the way ordinary people organized around a private kindness and made it public in ways that cared for the person involved. There was pushback. There always is when stories spread. A few voices argued that celebrity involvement must be skeptical, that donations that stem from a single video could be fickle. They were right to raise the point. The organizers took those critiques seriously and made choices that emphasized accountability. They partnered with an established outreach center, they published a modest quarterly update on where funds had gone, and they prioritized help that would not hinge on someone else's attention span. By the time the first season of rain had passed into the blue-light clear days of late spring, the bench on the platform became, in the city's small catalog of signposts, something like a quiet landmark. Not a shrine, but a reminder that beneath the hum of trains and the rush of lives, small kindnesses can be contagious. That public spaces can hold private mercies. That a single correct glance, the recognition of a hum, a hand gesture, can flip an ordinary afternoon into an occasion of mutual humanity. The teenager sometimes thought about the man in the cap, about the way the cap had been lowered and then lifted, like a curtain revealing not an actor but a flesh-and-blood listener. He replayed the recorded message for his sister on mornings when the world felt thin. He kept the lighter in a pocket like a charm, not for smoking, but for the symbolic measure of heat and light that goes beyond flame. It was a small thing. Small things had become his ledger. Months later, the community's modest program had a name. Nothing grandiose, just the kind of practical title that would not attract headlines but would do work. Warm Hands. It began as a way to fund Saturday meals and bus passes, then evolved into a partnership model with local businesses willing to donate time or goods. A donor, who had seen the original clip in a late-night feed, contributed a monthly sum to cover emergency phone minutes for at-risk teens. Volunteers who had come for a single day began to return. The teenager, who once kept his head down, now sat at planning meetings when he could, sometimes offering small ideas that would not have occurred to someone who hadn't lived his life. The man in the cap watched from a distance, and sometimes from a bench in the back of the cafe, paying nothing more than the price of a coffee and the privilege of being quietly informed. He never called attention to his role. But there were evenings when he and the teenager crossed paths again. They would nod, share a few words, sometimes laugh at a private joke no one else knew. Once, when the teenager's sister came in for her first free Saturday meal, the man stood up and shook her hand as if she were a person in her own right, not an adjunct to the story, not an image in a post. He complimented her on her tough smile, and she blushed in the slow way young people do when someone she admires speaks kindly. At the center of these modest developments was a question that people rarely ask aloud, but which shaped every choice. What does it mean to help without spectacle? The answer, in this case, was not to hide generosity, but to center the dignity of the person receiving it. The community learned to ask the teenager what he needed, to take no for an answer when he preferred not to be photographed, and to funnel contributions into practical supports rather than headline-grabbing giveaways. If you remember one image from those months, it might be a small one. The tile of the platform, the chipped edge of the bench, the lighter tucked into a pocket, and the laminated card taped in a modest way that read, without drama, "Community meals every Saturday." That card carried a kind of ordinary holiness, an invitation that presumed people's worth. A few journalists returned, not to chronicle a celebrity's every step, but to tell a subtler story, how a city, in its small interconnected ways, responds to one human moment. They wrote about the ripple effects and about the systems that remain stubborn. They wrote, too, about the limits of attention and about the work that cannot be done by a single recorded exchange. In that honesty, there was wisdom. The people who had stepped forward kept their expectations modest. They tracked outcomes, lined up volunteers, and kept a ledger of what boots and bus passes could accomplish in the near term. For the teenager, the practical changes mattered. The boots kept his feet dry in the first autumn rain. The bus pass changed the geometry of his day. He could get to a tutoring center farther away. He could pick up shifts that paid better. He could visit his sister's school more often. These were incremental victories. They did not erase years of hard luck, but they gave oxygen to plans that had once seemed like fantasies. As for the man in the cap, his life did not stop being complicated in the wake of a subway encounter. He still had obligations and tours and the restless calendar of a public person. But he had made a choice. He would not stage kindness as entertainment. He would be present, in small ways, where he could be real without the theater. The difference between the applause and the anonymous good was one of quality and intention, and the people around him noticed. The teenager noticed too. He began to trust that some people could act without needing photographs as proof. The story settled into the fabric of the neighborhood like a patch on a well-worn coat. It was not a tidy ending to anything. Instead, it was a sustained quiet. The cafe's whiteboard with names, the occasional donation that kept the Saturday meals running, the shelter that found a volunteer willing to help with job applications. A series of small, connected acts added up to a kind of structural kindness that was practical and repeatable. The platform where they had met remained a place where the city exhaled its daily sorrows and joys. Commuters still rushed, trains still arrived with their metallic sighs. But now, if you sat on the bench near the station's flickering lamp, you might notice the laminated card and the faint scuff where someone had once kneaded the leather of a lighter in his palm. You might catch, in the same way the teenager had, a hum that felt like a name, and remember that recognition does not always mean exploitation. Sometimes it means a choice to listen. Years down the line, warm hands would be a modest line on a long list of neighborhood charities. Never a national headline, never a venture capital story. It would help a few thousand meals, provide shoes to dozens of kids, and offer bus passes and mentorship to those who needed them. It would not end systemic problems, but it would offer a proof of concept. Small acts, repeated, make a measurable difference. It would teach a generation of volunteers about dignity and discretion and how to center the person instead of the story. And the teenager, no longer a child folded into the edges of other people's days, would tell his sister the story with a particular pride. Not the pride that seeks admiration, but the quiet pride of survival and of being treated like a person. He would tell her how a stranger had given him a lighter, how that lighter became a key to warmer shoes and new opportunities, how a simple private promise had become a handful of open hands across the neighborhood. When she asked if it had been weird that someone famous had helped, he would say he was just a person. He listened. If you want to do more than watch moments unfold, there is a way to help that respects both dignity and impact. Check the description for a link to support vetted local youth outreach programs that prioritize accountability and person-first care. A small gift can fund a meal, a pair of shoes, or a bus pass. Simple things that change a day's geometry. If this story left you with something, consider being part of the ordinary work that follows a single kind moment. The subway platform carries its own history of comings and goings. People starting jobs, leaving relationships, carrying babies, dragging duffel bags. It holds the day's ordinary miracles. The night the man in the cap stepped out of anonymity, the platform did not change its face. It simply contained a moment that rippled outward, not because of the person's name, but because someone chose to act kindly and others chose to follow suit. The last image is small and steady. The bench, a laminated card, a lighter in a pocket. But it is enough. It insists in a low voice that being seen without being displayed is sometimes the greatest kindness we can offer.